to come out for meals. Her shame was tangible. Not shame for having come home pregnant, but shame for having left in the first place. She did not speak, and Whaiaori did not push her. On the morning of the 4th day, she rose and got dressed in the clean clothes Whaiaori had laid out for her. In the kitchen, Whaiaori was scrubbing the floor. Mere went to the table where bread and lard were laid out. "Good morning, Whaia," she said quietly. "Ai," said her aunt without stopping. Mere ate. Then Whaiaori handed her the bucket. "Finish the floors, kōtiro. It will be good for when the baby comes. Good practice." They spent the morning like that. Civil, practical. Mere was glad simply to have something to occupy her mind and her hands. By the time the morning had stretched itself into noon, she felt the same old suffocation of her adolescence. She crumpled to the floor, camouflaging her sobs as gasps for air. Whaiaori quickly assessed the situation and gathered in her fright so as not to alarm the girl. Mere straightened herself. She looked at her aunt, not a flicker of emotion on her face. Audrey held the remnants of a loaf, probably made with her mother's rewena. It anchored her, and for the first time she connected the feeling to the aunt who was always there. She wanted to say something to show how she felt. Then Whaiaori turned away, her back hard like tōtara, and the moment passed. Early afternoon, Tu and the boys came home, stopping short when they saw Mere in the kitchen. No one ran to Mere to embrace her. No one questioned her. Whaiaori had warned, "Let her come to us when she is ready." Now they slipped into their old household routine. Tu's initial relief at having his daughter home had turned into surliness. Mere didn't know what to say to him. She could only read disappointment in his eyes. There was a vast world between them now. When the baby came, it was harder for Mere than she could have known. The pain almost overwhelmed her. She thought only of her rai, how he should have been there, how among the things he'd lived through was a grief caused by the actions of her own people. She bore the grief as she laboured. As she felt the tug at her womb, she said goodbye to her husband and hello to her son. Mere loved her boy from the first moment. "Te kaha," she announced, looking pointedly at her aunts, Whaiaori and Whaiaina. Mere remained in her room for a week. She didn't expect visitors and received none. Still, she did expect her father and brothers to come to welcome her son, and they did not. After 2 weeks, Whaiaina performed some karakia of protection, and Mere returned to her domestic duties. Her father showed no interest in his grandchild and offered no karakia of his own. Mere realised she had expected some sort of reconciliation after the birth of the first grandchild. There was none to be had. If anything, Tu became more distant. Te kaha, Mere had her own strength. The space left by Rai had been filled by this child, and she knew where her allegiance lay. Tu was a father to her no more. That autumn the journey to the island of Motuoro was subdued. No one was in the mood to revisit the events of the previous year, so there was no objection when Mere announced she'd prefer to stay at the house. John knew his father was troubled by the baby at Mere's breast, that he did not even consider him to be his grandchild. When they'd learnt Mere and Iraia had taken off together, Tu had cursed the day his uncle had brought the slave girl home. She had given birth to Iraia soon after. The boy and his mother had stayed. They had nothing to go back to. They owned nothing. And John remembered hearing the adults speak of how the Mōkai had been so broken by the transgressions on their tapu that they became walking ghosts. Not dead, but not really alive either. Tu had thought the boy of the same stock as his mother, slow to react, weak-minded, but good enough for work. No one considered him a threat. They'd never imagined Mere saw him as anything other than a pet. How stupid they'd been. And now the curse continued. Another boy, with higher papa blood this time. It was wrong. Even marrying their bloodline to settlers would have been better than producing offspring of a race dying faster than their own. As the descent into colder weather began, everyone on the island had to work harder. It was evident Tu had begun to feel his age. On the final trip back from Motuora, he told John they would go to Picton first to deal with some land business. Tu faced demands from both sides of the family to agree to selling blocks of land. There was so much land, so much untouched, the settlers thought it was wasted. Tu spent some time at the land sales office while John waited outside. Finally, his father emerged. "Son," he said, "this day will either have been very good for us or very bad. I need a whiskey." They walked to the hotel. Tu ordered a whiskey for himself and a beer for his son. Quietly, Tu told John that when he was a child, his people would not have mixed like this in the towns. But the world was changing, he said, each year bringing more migrants and more miraculous Pākehā inventions, gas, steamships, machinery, and for everything the Pākehā brought, they took more land, as if they'd had every right to make use of whatever was in front of them. They had a different way of seeing the world, Tu told his son. He figured the only way he could make a place for his people in the world was to use the Pākehā methods. It seemed that he looked at life with two sets of eyes now. John had never heard his father speak like this, his tongue loosened by the drink. He felt the effects of the alcohol in his own mind and body. His legs had gone light and his toes prickled. After Mere left with Iraia, Tu would return from town stinking and disorientated, to be sent to bed by an irate Whaia Audrey. The next morning at the breakfast table, there would be lectures on the evils of Waipiro, with all manners of quotes and proverbs from the Bible and the tupuna. "I'll have another, Mr. Roberts," a voice boomed from behind Tu's shoulder. John saw a large man with a closely trimmed red beard. The stranger extended his hand to Tu and exclaimed, "Jack O'Connor's the name. Pleased to be meeting you, sir. Been in this country now for near on half a day, and I find myself pleased and humbled by the landscape and now the company."
And we'll have the next episode of Where the Rekohu Bone Sings for you same time tomorrow on 9 to noon. It's written by Tina Markareti and adapted for radio by Owen Scott. More feedback, particularly on recycling, is just pouring in. This listener says, when will the New Zealand government introduce a 10-cent consumer refund on returned bottles and cans which are able to be recycled? The New South Wales state government recently introduced a 10-cent refund on approved drink cans, glass and plastic bottles, following a lead pioneered in South Australia some years ago. The recovery has had a huge impact on lowering the amount of discarded drink containers. Those accepting used drink containers include smaller businesses and purpose-built recycling stations within shopping centre car parks. I believe New Zealand could introduce this scheme very quickly by following this recycling plan. And now, still to come on the program after the news, talking to technology commentator Paul Matthews. He'll look at the GPS manufacturer Garmin's ransomware attack that's forced it offline, plus new research dispels the link between violent video games and actual violence, and what's happening at Tech Week 2020. On our parenting slot, new research indicates that preschoolers don't need early bedtimes to be healthy. That's as long as they are getting enough sleep. And we'll round off the morning with our screen reviewer James Crute talking about Love Lives Save Me Too in this town.
No, it just says live. The answers from I don't care about which one. I'm like, you're hyping your story that is slow. That's me.
It's midnight tonight. Take your time.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming today. My name is Helene Quilter, and I'm the Deputy State Services Commissioner. And with me is the Inquirer, Mr. Michael Heron QC. So what we're going to do, Michael will give you the findings from his report, then I will say a few words, and then we'll open up for questions. So thank you, Michael.
Morena, tēnā koutou katoa. As you'll recall, on the 4th of July, the New Zealand Herald reported that it had received this confidential information, patient details on a spreadsheet with names, dates of birth, etc., and there was some public interest that resulted. Radio New Zealand also reported that it had seen this document with the same details, and other media channels reported that. On the 6th of July, I was appointed by the State Services Commissioner to investigate and make findings and report on the causes of the incident, who was responsible, and whether there were risks of ongoing breaches. And you'll recall, as at the 6th of July, the concern was that this might have come from the public service. The investigation was also to look at whether there was compliance with relevant policies and whether things could be improved, etc., other relevant matters. You'll also remember that the Inquiries Act doesn't allow me to reach findings of liability. That's, of course, for the courts, but I can identify some further steps that can be taken. That was, of course, the 6th of July, and you'll remember also that the next day after the inquiry was announced, Mr. Walker and then Ms. Bogue issued press releases accepting responsibility for the disclosures. So it's in that light that I can give you my summary of findings. Firstly, Ms. Bogue and Mr. Walker were each responsible for the unauthorised disclosure of this sensitive personal information. Their motivations were political. Their actions were not justified or reasonable. Each acknowledged their error publicly and cooperated fully with this inquiry, and I commend them for that. The Ministry of Health policy and process in notifying emergency services of active cases was a considered response to the pressures arising during the early stages of this crisis. Whether that policy was appropriate in the circumstances applicable in April will be the subject of further review by the Privacy Commissioner. It's my view the policy and process should have been reviewed once there were no longer cases in the community, and the dissemination to emergency services of personal information like this ought to have stopped. In any event, there ought to have been better protection over the personal information. I go on to make some comments in the report as to possible referrals by the State Services Commissioner. I note that the Ministry is reviewing its policies and processes. It has accepted, I'm told this morning, the findings of this report. And I suppose in conclusion, I'd just say the report notes that ultimately any system is vulnerable to the actions of persons who seek to misuse confidential information. The responsibility for that lies, of course, with Mr. Walker and Ms. Bogue. And on that note, I'll hand back to Ms. Quilter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For context, it's important to note that when we started this investigation, we were looking at a possible leak of information in the public service. That turned out not to be the case. After the investigation was announced, new information came to light, which you are all aware of because it was widely reported in the media. It was, however, important the investigation continued to establish all of the facts and to fulfil the terms of reference as they apply to the public service. My jurisdiction covers the public service and public servants. When a mistake is made in the public service, the expectation on chief executives is clear. Own it, fix it, and learn from it. On that point, the Director General of Health has taken responsibility for the areas identified for improvement in Mr. Heron's report, and he is addressing these. That is what I expect chief executives in the public service to do. The Ministry of Health's policy and process should have been reviewed once there were no longer active COVID-19 cases in the community. It should have been reviewed, and it was not. But let's not forget, the Ministry of Health was operating in the context of a global pandemic with an ever-present risk of community transmission. I'm not going to criticise the Ministry of Health beyond that when lives have been saved as a result of their actions in helping New Zealand fight COVID-19. The information should not have been placed in the public arena, and the Ministry of Health did not place it there. My jurisdiction does not, however, extend to private citizens and members of Parliament. By their own admission, the people who placed the information in the public arena were Ms. Michelle Bogue and Mr. Hamish Walker, MP. The report confirms that. This raises privacy issues that I am unable to deal with because I do not have jurisdiction. It is not my job to judge the actions of Ms. Bogue or Mr. Walker. That is not a matter for me. I have therefore referred Mr. Heron's report to the Privacy Commissioner, Mr. John Edwards. In particular, I have referred the findings around Ms. Bogue, the Auckland Rescue Helicopter Trust, and Mr. Walker for specific attention. Mr. Heron has advised me the Privacy Commissioner may not have jurisdiction over Mr. Walker. Nevertheless, that is a matter for the Privacy Commissioner to determine. Thank you.
Given the lack of jurisdiction that you've spoken about in regards to the State Services Commissioner and even perhaps the Privacy Commissioner, is Michelle Bogue and Hamish Walker getting off free here?
The purpose of this investigation was to establish the facts of the situation and to determine the appropriate course of action. And in so doing, we have established that there was a failing on the part of the Ministry of Health and that it should have reviewed its policies and practice. I don't have jurisdiction over the actions of Ms. Bogue or Mr. Walker. Their actions and Mr. Heron's findings are being referred to the Privacy Commissioner. Now, in addition, I have also referred or shared a copy of the report with the leader of the National Party and the Speaker of the House, because they're referenced in the report, and they may have some jurisdictional interest.
Do you think there'll be a public concern though that they could get off easy?
Well, that is not a matter for me to comment on. What I have to do is to refer the findings to those who have jurisdiction so that they can consider the matter.
You said that the Ministry of Health should have reviewed its policy of sending out the information, but what about the fact that the information is being sent without any password protection, without any security around it?
Could you comment on that?
Yes, I comment on that in the report, and I suggest that that isn't optimal, and I think the Ministry are looking at it. In fact, at the time of the policy, it was envisaged that they would have systems in place, end-to-end encryption, for example. So they certainly were mindful of that, but you'll understand the situation they were working under.
How much culpability lies in with the Ministry of Health or Health and Health?
Well, again, I do touch on this in the report, that ultimately whatever system you have, we've seen it in all sorts of contexts. If people deliberately want to release information contrary to the policies, the rules, the processes, they can do that.
Sorry, you say not protecting the information didn't appear to be reasonable, particularly when widespread community transmission wasn't an immediate risk. What about earlier in April? Do you think it was still reasonable or not reasonable at the time when there was community transmission to be sharing this information without any sort of protection or encryption?
It would have been optimal to protect it further, and that certainly was considered in the policy, but doesn't seem to have been done. So I also think it ought to have been protected further from the beginning. Yes. Nothing is foolproof, as we know. We've seen in various other leak situations.
Mr. Herring, how different do you think this report would have been if Mr. Walker didn't out himself as the man that received the information? Would you have powers to actually find that out?
It's a tricky hypothetical. The powers are there under the Inquiries Act, and there is, in theory, a power to order in certain circumstances, having balanced the considerations. I won't bore you with the legal jargon, but there is the power there under the Inquiries Act, and it's possible in certain inquiries that could have occurred, but in this kind of inquiry, I don't think that would have been answered, I suspect.
Do you think the announcement of the inquiry effectively smoked Mr. Walker out?
Well, that would be speculation. Other people have said that, but I don't know.
Were you able to look into who else Michelle Bogue may have sent that information to? Did you look into that?
Yes, well, I've touched on Mr. Woodhouse, and that's in the report. Ms. Bogue assured me that she didn't send it to anyone else.
But you didn't say, did you ask her if she sent it to other members within the National Party? Were you able to look into that? Was that part of the scope, or was that completely out of the realm?
It wasn't part of the scope, but I did ask her that, and she assured me that she hadn't, and I took her at her word.
You noted that you decided not to look further into Mr. Woodhouse's claim that he deleted the data.
Yes.
Can you go into why?
Yeah, the reason why is we thought about that, and it didn't seem to me ultimately germane to the inquiry itself, but also Mr. Woodhouse assured me that he had deleted the material. Ms. Bogue told me what material had been sent to Mr. Woodhouse. So I really didn't see much point in going any further with that, because when you come back to my inquiry, it was about this leak of this information, and so I didn't feel it needed to be run down any further, I guess, and it really wouldn't have taken me anywhere.
Commissioner, we have the health system and the health and emergency services system is a patchwork of trusts, volunteers, community organisations. Do you think it's actually plausible to require a system in which there is encryption, password protection? Some of these organisations which are running on a smell noisy rag and perhaps don't have the IT capacity to actually deal with the high level of security that this sort of information requires.
Look, I haven't, I haven't gone into that. I haven't investigated it. It would be for the Ministry of Health to make such determination. In regard to this situation, they felt that they had a responsibility to get that information to first responders, so police and emergency services, who could be involved in responding to the needs of the individuals that were identified as having active cases. So I don't know about the IT systems of the emergency services. I can't comment.
The wider state sector has IT policies around privacy. Does this appear to have contravened those wider IT policies around privacy in any way? Or do we actually have them? Am I mistaken?
No, there are, of course, policies around privacy, and the Ministry of Health does conform to those policies. The decision that it made at the time was that it was necessary that first responders have the information about active COVID cases, who the people were and where they were located. And if you recall, this was at a time when we had active community transmission with clusters in the community, and we also had people who were self-isolating. So it was on that basis that the Ministry of Health determined the information ought to be made available.
And that serious threat justification which was used for this, for distributing this widely, that's an ultimate kind of workaround in any circumstance. If there is a perceived serious threat, then that those the rigours around privacy and IT are relaxed to enable the broader distribution of quite confidential information.
Yep. Do you want me to? I mean, obviously the Privacy Commissioner is the expert on this, but yes, but subject to reasonable protections around the confidentiality of the information and only as necessary. So there is a whole lot of constraints on that. You can't just go and send it out anywhere because there is a serious threat.
Did you find Hamish Walker and Michelle Bogan credible in the explanation to you?
Yes, they were candid and frank, much as they have been in public.
Did they express regret?
Yes.
If it weren't for this leak and this inquiry, do you think that this information would still be shared as widely as it had been at that time?
Well, again, it's slight speculation, but certainly the ministry was intending to review its policies. You'll remember how dynamic this situation was and is. So I don't doubt that this would have been reflected on at some stage.
In terms of Michael Woodhouse, was it appropriate for him to delete those emails?
Yes, I think it was. I've said in the report that ideally he would have alerted the minister or the ministry to this, and ideally he would have counselled Ms. Bogue not to disseminate this material, but it seemed to make...
Asking him that he knew that there was an inquiry underway.
I see, yeah.
Deleted them. Was that appropriate?
Well, I can't speak for him on that. I guess he wasn't going to send them on or use them further, is what he said to me, and therefore he deleted them.
As an
But he
inquiry
only
lead,
deleted
though,
them
is that appropriate
once the
behaviour?
inquiry was underway.
Well, I guess you'll have to ask him that. I certainly looked at it and didn't feel I needed to take it further for the reasons that I explained earlier.
And just in terms of the difference between the information that he received and that Hamish Walker received, how different was that information?
I couldn't say with precision, but you'll recall the spreadsheet that we're talking about was the 2nd of July, and these were late in June. So they would have been different. You probably can go back to the ministry data and ascertain that they would have been active cases, but different active cases.
Did you
So
get
different names.
One would presume so, but an overlap as well, one would presume.
So not significantly different, it would seem.
Well, certainly, I think the phrase I've used is similar information, similar spreadsheets.
Did you get any sense
Well, it was the same motivation as I understood it. It was political.
And because he deleted those emails, did that hinder your ability to get to the bottom of what that motivation was?
No, and I think I answered that earlier.
The Auckland Rescue Helicopter Trust issued a statement at the time saying it did not breach the privacy of COVID-19 patients. None of its patient information had been subject to any privacy breach. It may not be hugely material, but given you say in the report there's agreement that Ms. Bogue received the information in her capacity as Chief Executive, and that her actions in disseminating the information wouldn't have been compliant with the trust policy. Was that statement then incorrect to say that there had been no breach at the trust's end?
Well, ultimately, I suppose that'll be for the Privacy Commissioner, but if she was acting in her capacity as acting CEO, then the Rescue Helicopter Trust needs to deal with that with the Privacy Commissioner.
Mr. Heron, one of the more bizarre aspects of this case is that Mr. Walker released the information to sort of prove that he wasn't a racist. Now, in your report, you said he acknowledged that he didn't prove his point. Did he give any indication to you about why he thought that might be the case? Why he thought that it might? Did he go into any more detail about why he did it? Why he thought it would prove he wasn't a racist? Totally unrelated.
Well, you'll see his motivations, as I've set out in the report, were twofold. One, his concern about an influx from 3 particular countries and the lack of preparedness of his constituency. That was his first. And the second was to demonstrate that this information was flowing around with the absence of security. Whether he succeeded or not, well, that's for you to judge, I think, but those were the explanations he gave.
Was it, sorry, just building on that, what was it in the information that he thought would prove that he wasn't racist?
No, I can't answer that for him.
Your concern at the routine dissemination of personal information, how big a concern is that? And also, what did you make of the fact that you had MPs and mayors asking for this type of information?
How big a concern? You'll see in the report that one a COVID patient wrote to me separately, a person who had been implicitly identified in the community, not one on the list but an earlier case, and that person reported being harassed or bullied as a result of that. I took that on its face. It was concerning, and that was a consequence of implicit identification, not explicit, but implicit. So it certainly was a concern. And sorry, your next part of your question was?
MPs and mayors asking to be privy to this type of information.
Well, you can see that certainly as reflected in the ministry policy, people were very interested in this information, so they were prepared, and that flows through into the ministry policy. But perhaps also it was of political interest, I don't know.
What I think is that the Ministry of Health needs to determine who needs to know. You know, that has to be the basis of the issue of information. And I am advised by the Ministry they had a basis at the time in terms of providing the information to first responders. I think it's important to remember the Ministry of Health didn't put that information in the public arena. That information was put in the public arena by Ms. Bogue and Mr. Walker by their own admission, and that is what has caused the privacy breach.
Do MPs and mayors need to know this information?
It would be difficult for me, this is speculative, but to imagine why MPs need to know. If local government are running emergency service situations, there might be a basis, but it would depend on the function, and I wouldn't say all local government need to know.
Are you satisfied now with the state of security of this information at the Ministry of Health?
What I'm satisfied with is that the Director General of Health has accepted all of the findings in this report and is addressing those. And I have his assurance, and I am satisfied that he is responding appropriately.
Is it reasonable for an MP to think, because they don't fall under the Privacy Act, that it would be warranted for them to leak this information?
Well, Mr. Walker doesn't suggest that is the case, but so it's rather hypothetical in the sense that he clearly accepts that he was wrong in doing this. So I'm not sure what your question is.
Would it be appropriate for MPs to think that this was an appropriate action, given that they aren't covered under that Act?
I don't think anyone feels that way. Certainly not Mr. Walker or Ms. Bogue, I don't think, and nor me.
Is it a justified exemption in general under the Act? I'm not sure. What would be proper uses of that exemption for an MP who would need to share information that might otherwise breach the Privacy Act? Well,
again, it's rather hypothetical, but you can see that MPs are critical voices of the public, so one doesn't want to have them constrained unduly, but they are subject to other rules and restrictions, standing orders, for example.
Ms. Coulter, do you think that the public would want to see some liability here from Ms. Bogue and Mr. Walker, and have they not gotten that today? And is that frustrating for you, given the scope?
Look, I don't have jurisdiction over the actions of Ms. Bogue or Mr. Walker, and that is the reason why I have referred Mr. Heron's report to the Privacy Commissioner, so he can consider the findings made in relation to those two individuals.
Do you think there should be some liability?
It's not my role to, I don't have a personal opinion on it.
Do you think the public would want to see that?
I think that the public would want to see that they are treated appropriately in relation to the breach of the information. It will be for the Privacy Commissioner to determine that, because I don't have jurisdiction.
What would the consequences be if it was a public servant that hadn't leaked that information?
Potentially it could have been criminal, depending on the motivations of the individual. And that's what we were looking at when we started this investigation. We didn't know who was responsible for providing the information.
Just because these two sit outside of the public service, should that change?
I'm only talking about what applies to public servants here. That's my jurisdiction.
What about the fact that the public service information ended up in a private email account, an extra address, not an organizational address? Is there any capacity for ministries to implement policies that would stop private information from ending up in a personal email account when that's not ultimately who it was addressed to?
Do you want to answer to that?
You'll be aware that a lot of people run business addresses. This was Ms. Bogue's business address that she had given to the ministry. It's not unusual for material to be sent to business addresses if they're acknowledged and accepted as being that address. It's something that has come up again and again as to what security can be put around that. It's quite a complex issue, I'm afraid.
It's quite heavily dependent on people following the policy advice at the bottom of the email that is always sent to them, right?
Yeah, it's heavily dependent on human factors, really.
And how disappointing is it that this information was leaked?
It shouldn't have been leaked. Shouldn't have.
And Mr. Heron, in terms of, in your legal opinion, is there any criminal liability for Ms. Bogue or Hamish Walker?
Well, you'll recall where I started. It's not my place to talk about liability, but you will have also seen Mr. Walker got advice that this wasn't a criminal matter. I would agree with that. This is
Ms. Bogue and
Yeah, I mean, on the face, I mean, it's not my role to talk about liability, but as a general proposition, this is not a criminal matter. But as to civil liability, that's a matter for courts to ultimately.
Do you think there could be potential civil liability?
Well, that's for the Privacy Commissioner and ultimately what's called the Human Rights Review Tribunal that deals with breaches of privacy if they go that far.
There's a bit of a problem though that this information is generated by the state sector, or the use of the state sector, and what is clearly, you know, a health response from the state sector. It's then given to a private email account, even though it's generated by the state sector for the state sector's use. And once it's in that private email account, we're in a situation now where you say, well, we can't actually do anything about it. So how do New Zealanders, who the government has all sorts of information on them, how do they know that that information isn't then going to go to private email accounts where you don't have jurisdiction to actually protect them from it?
It wasn't a private email account, it was Miss Bogue's business account.
But for the purposes of this, it's not a public sector email account.
No,
It
but
is her email account in her position as the acting chief executive of the Auckland Rescue Helicopter Trust.
and
We're an emergency provider.
The point is that you have no jurisdiction over it because if it went to Michelle Bogue's email account, were she an employee of a DHB, then you would probably be able to take a much more serious and sanction against her. You cannot in this case, despite the fact that were she an employee of the DHB or a private individual employed by the Rescue Helicopter Trust, what she did would have been the same thing. It's just that your ability to protect New Zealanders from that problem is vastly different because of essentially the letters after her email address.
well, I think that's one picture, but just bear in mind there are, of course, contractual provisions between the Ministry and the Rescue Helicopter Trust. There are also the Privacy Act that applies. So there is the general law and contractual restrictions that apply. So it's quite understandable the State Services Commissioner only deals with the public service.
And are you satisfied with the contractual obligations that are imposed upon the Helicopter Trust and other such organisations? Do you think that they protect people in cases like this?
Well, we certainly didn't find fault in the policy and the contractual obligations.
Sorry, just to go back, it was sent to Michelle Bogue's personal email address, not her business account, because that was the email address that she had given to the Ministry of...
When you say personal, it was her business address, the Bogue Allen business address, but her own, if you know what I mean. So
why is the Ministry of Health then sending patient data to an email address that is not linked to any health organisation?
Well, that ultimately is a question that the Privacy Commissioner will look at, but the Ministry dealt with each of the emergency services organisations and got the approved email addresses. You'll remember from the report that Ms Bogue was acting CEO, and she explained that was the address that she gave rather than an ARHT address. So,
And should an alarm bell should gone, maybe ding ding ding, let's not do that?
well, that'll be a question that the Privacy Commissioner may look at.
Was there any investigation, was there any sort of forensic IT investigation of Ms Bogue's, Mr Walker's or Mr Woodhouse's email addresses, or did you speak to them and take them at their word that what they had received, sent and deleted was what they said?
I spoke to them or received statements from them or communicated with them, and I took them at their word.
Do you see how some people might find that a little problematic, given their behaviour?
Some people, I can't speak for some people, but one has to bear in mind that they have, or in particular, Mr Walker and Ms Bogue have made it public. They've certainly expressed sincere regret. I've found them candid and sincerely regretful, and frankly, they have had consequences, pretty severe consequences. Well, of course, had they misled me, that might have been a much more serious matter. So I certainly had no reason to believe that I was being misled. In fact, I had the opposite.
How will you know?
Well, how does anyone know?
Forensic IT investigations of the email accounts.
But of course, that is something that only goes so far. For example, which accounts and how far back, and do I search deleted, and do you know what I mean? I mean, we can search forever for these things at some stage, much like the systems that prevail. We have to take people at face value sometimes.
But these particular people, you're okay to take them at face value?
Well, on these particular matters, I was,
On
yes.
these particular matters, they only came forward once they knew they'd been caught. They weren't honest with the public. Why would they be honest with you?
Well, that's a fair comment, but I certainly accepted what I was being told. It made sense to me. It was consistent with what they'd said publicly, and I had no reason to doubt what I was being told.
Did you feel time pressure in getting this inquiry done?
Well, it was a relatively short time frame. It was certainly assisted by the admissions that were made public the day after it was announced. So that was a great help, actually.
Is the time frame, did that play any part in things that you did or didn't do?
No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, time is a factor. We needed to get this done.
What do you make about Michelle Bogue and Hamish Walker corresponding only after Hamish Walker was receiving media queries? Correctly, he received media queries about the press release that was racist, and then he was given a list after those media queries. That's the timing that you've got before.
I'm sorry, I don't know that timing. Do you mean media queries about his initial press?
The initial press release.
Right.
Press release. He gets media queries about racism, and then he gets the timing. Then he communicates with Bogue.
No, I haven't reflected that, I don't think, and I don't make anything of that one way or the other.
Ms. Coulter, is it ever justifiable to leak private medical details about anyone?
I don't think it's acceptable to leak private information in public service. I think that the requirements about that and the need to protect private information and to ensure that it only goes to people who need to know, I think that would be my position.
Sorry, to go back to Thomas's point, so the timeline of this was, so Hamish Walker didn't receive this patient information until he was accused of being a racist. Then Michelle Bogue sent it to him in an effort to help him out. Was that the timeline in the report?
I'd have to go back. I don't think I set that.
I might have had the sentences out.
Yeah, I suspect you might have there.
But Hamish Walker gave assurances that he'd only been sent this information once.
He had only received this from Michelle Bogue once, yes.
And that was on the day.
I'm sorry, I'd need to go back to the detail. I believe it was on the 2nd of July, because it was the spreadsheet of the 2nd of July, and then he forwarded it to the media that evening and the next day. And I think the Herald was first, and then there were two others, NZME and stuff. I'm sorry, Ms Agnew Harrington's helping me from the back, who knows the detail, but there were three media organisations, and Mr Walker outlined he sent, I think, the Herald first on the 2nd of July and perhaps the next two on the 3rd of July. Does that help?
What time was Mr. Walker sent the information from Michelle Bogue?
We don't know for sure, but it was after 11:02 when the spreadsheet was first sent out, and it was before sometime in the evening when he sent to the first media organisation.
I think you mean 11:40.
11:40, I beg your pardon. Yeah, it's in the detail.
That's when the Ministry of Health sent it out.
Yes, when they sent it out, and when it was received was some 2 minutes later, I think. And then it was sent on to Mr. Walker following that, when it was received by Ms. Bogue, I think.
And you were able, so you asked Ms. Bogue whether she had circulated around other people?
Yes, I did.
And you're absolutely certain that she did not?
No, I can't be absolutely certain. She told me she didn't, and I accepted that.
Do you accept, given the events of the last few weeks, that claim might possibly require extra scrutiny?
Well, it depends if you're looking into that claim, it might, but I wasn't.
So, hang on, sorry, just go back to the timeline here. So you say, Hamish Walker is quoted in this report saying, Ms. Bogue provided me with this information for me to use in my defence against the accusation of racism. So that would imply that he sent this statement, which was later called racist, that afternoon. He said then that Michelle Bogue then sent him that information to help back up his claim. So is that the timeline on that?
I'm not sure of the sequence between his claim and it certainly was on the 2nd of July.
Yeah, I'm trying to pick holes in that he only received information from Ms. Bogue once, which he said, and whether you believe that. Because whether it was he got called racist first and then got the information to back up the claim, or whether he got the information first and then used that to then issue a statement. Because if it was the latter, that would imply that it perhaps was not the first time he'd been sent that information.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry, I can't have any further than
Okay, but so
is in the document.
You take him at his word that he had only been sent that information once from Ms. Bogue?
Yes, I think. If I've reflected that in the document, I don't know whether he said, I only got that spreadsheet once on that day, but that's my recollection of it.
To that point, so the current point 11, sorry,
Yes.
on the same day, Ms. Bogue forwarded that email and the spreadsheet to Hamish Walker. Later that day, he sent the spreadsheet to three media organisations.
Yes.
That appears to directly conflict in paragraph in point 15, where he says that in his distress he spoke to Ms. Bogue. He explained that she forwarded me the email. So that would suggest that, to Amelia's point, she forwarded him the email after he made that inquiry, which is not what it says in point 11, which is that he had the email before the media inquiries.
I don't see them as being in contradiction. Well, it's not intended to be that way, sorry.
Right. But that says, so 11 says that he had the spreadsheet before the media inquiries about the press release. 15 says that he received it after contacting her after receiving that inquiry.
I don't read 11 as saying what you say it says. Sorry, I don't think it says anything about the press release.
Did you see the email receipts? Did you see the email?
Yes, we saw the email that came out of the Ministry of Health. I then read the contents from Ms. Bogue, and then I was given the attachment from Mr. Walker. I didn't actually see the spreadsheet contents because I didn't want to, but I saw the train of emails.
But you saw the timestamp?
Yeah, I did, yeah.
You said there's a train of emails.
Well, sorry, the sequence of emails. So the one that came out of the ministry, and then I was read by Council and Ms. Bogue, the one that she received, which tracked back to the original one, and then Mr. Walker's council sent me the spreadsheet, which also tracked back to the ministry one. And as I said, I didn't want to look at the contents of it because I didn't think I needed to. I was just reassured, and we were reassured that they linked.
Do you think the patients who had their information leaked will be comfortable that you took the people who leaked that information at their word?
I don't know what they'll think. I hope they will find some comfort in the fact that we certainly all agree, as do Ms. Bogue and Mr. Walker, that this is unacceptable.
Would you mind just reading the entire report for us? We've got it on camera.
You must need a good sleep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm still trying, Thomas, to get to the bottom of your...
That's all right.
Have you